The Event Industry News podcast is sponsored by Present Communications. Present provides broadcast quality live, hybrid, and virtual event production trusted by organizations where reliability really matters. From corporate town halls and conferences to high-profile live streams, they deliver fully resilient systems that work first time. Hello everybody, welcome along to the Event Industry News podcast with me, James Dixon. Wishing all a very good morning, afternoon or evening, whenever or wherever you tune into today's podcast from. And today very much so, whenever my guest tunes in and joins today's podcast from, because they're away at the moment. They're abroad with a 5-hour time difference, but I'm very, very grateful to anybody who sort of gets up early and puts a little bit of time in their diary to join us on the podcast and have a little bit of a conversation about what they do in the events industry. My guest today is a first-time visitor to this here Event Industry News podcast, and I'm looking forward to finding out a bit more about them, a bit more about their company, what they do in the industry, and what their thoughts are on the industry at the moment. Joining me today is Mark Hutchinson. Mark is the Managing Director of INCEPTION. Mark, a very warm welcome to the podcast. How are you?
Hi, yeah, very well. Good to be here, and I'm looking forward to connecting and discussing more around the subject that we discussed previously, and sharing some insights and a bit more about the what we do as an agency with your listeners.
Absolutely. Agency. I think there's a little bit of a hint into where we may be going and what you do as a business, Mark. But tell us a little bit about yourself first of all, professional background, and how it led to you forming and running INCEPTION.
Yeah, no, great. I mean, like many people that have come across and connected with in the industry, it's not always a linear career line. So I actually started out originally in radio, believe it or not. So I was at a radio station. I was doing a sidekick kind of young person's job where I was on a breakfast show, and I was doing activations and ticket giveaways and sponsorships and for GCAP Media. So it was one of the local radio stations. And then I actually progressed into managing their events team. So it was like Road Runners or Black Thunders, they were called back in the day. It was when radio had money, actually, which is great.
Yeah, I remember it, the classic days of the road show.
Yeah, so I used to manage the team that did road shows and activations and launch events for the radio station. And then when I saw that radio was getting less funding and it was going more into other media areas, I decided to move on and then move into event production and technical production. And I was actually at a LED screen and technology company that used to buy in tech and then rent it into the industrial sector and into creative agencies and into permanent installations. And then during that time, I really felt frustrated with the creativity, actually. So I was finding that getting technical equipment or tech and selling it into agencies that were doing amazing work and amazing creative projects and things that really inspired me, I felt like that I wanted to actually transition into more of a creative agency eventually. And that's where my path led to actually moving into agency life or a creative agency and going through. I actually worked for 3 of them before starting INCEPTION and founding it back in 2019.
Okay, so as a creative agency, what are there? I guess I know the answer to this, but do you specialize in one particular area of events, or are you working on very much brand activation? Is it trade shows? Is it conferences? Is it all of these things combined for clients?
Yeah, I think creativity, as you say, is it can be a broad spectrum, but as an agency, we work in B2B and actually B2C, but it is mainly across trade shows and events itself. We do pop-up retail activations as well, so that's obviously B2C. But as an agency, we're mainly working across the trade show sector and product launches and retail activations.
Interesting. And how are you finding the process with that at the moment? Because I've worked on a personal level with a lot of companies over the years in helping to plan and run trade shows from a client, from an exhibitor point of view. So, I work with several companies who exhibit at a lot of trade shows a year. So I'm used to seeing it from that side of the fence, but I've also got some experience of dealing with it as an organizer side of things. And it's always interesting to see how the process and that evolutionary tail has developed over the years. How is it working for you from a client coordination point of view in terms of their involvement in the processes of things like trade shows nowadays?
Yeah, I think we always at Inception put ourselves in the client's shoes ultimately, and that's what gives us real strength, is thinking about what their sort of objectives are and their problems. So we start with the commercial problem and not necessarily the creative outcome, and that's what gives us, when we're dealing with the clients, is really thinking about what they're being asked to execute internally, and that's what gives us a really good approach when it comes to answering briefs or discussing it collaboratively with the marketing or CMO. I think what we're seeing in the market is obviously marketeers are under more pressure from a budget standpoint, but also they're also under more pressure from a results standpoint as well. So you've got two factors there that you have to really take into consideration. And I think really the budget pressure gets released when you start justifying the commercial outcome. And that's what we find, is that when we work with people and we look at the brand and what they're looking to achieve, if we can really go first looking at that commercial problem, prove that we are accelerating growth. So from a trade show or retail perspectives, that's sales or lead generation, the budget constraints get loosened slightly because you're starting to really justify it internally for the brand or the team that this is a real revenue generator, and it should be considered as a really serious area of the business.
Does it help now that you can track revenue generation further down the line on something like a brand activation than you could have done 10, 15, 20 years ago, because, let's say from a straightforward merchandise point of view, you take a clothing brand who might be, they can trace sales and things like that. But, the technology that we have to track interactions at things like brand events now is so much more advanced that actually that there are real tangible ways of tracking whether or not an event has generated income, profit, sales, post activation. Do you understand what I'm saying there?
No, definitely. I think it's looking at every opportunity to insert a metric, because ultimately, if you can get that trigger, like you're mentioning there, that you can then give the report after, and that's at every level, from dwell time to interactive activity with experiential or screens, etc., or tech. You can then make sure that you're looking at those metrics, pulling them together, and then coming up with a really strong ROI and report on the event itself. And that was historically always a challenge, is reporting on ROI in the events or trade show sector, because, as you say, some people will just be looking at it as a transactional moment where they were just looking at number of leads generated. Well, ultimately that could be leads generated that are people being scanned, where the salespeople run off and get as many as possible because they're being tasked with that. But really, that's not quality first. So we're looking at multiple different metrics and also the final result as well. And you do need to be doing that, because the sales cycle on some of the brands and businesses that we deal with can be up to 6 or 12 months. So you've got to be constantly looking at it and justifying the investment.
It's the Rambo approach sometimes to lead generation, isn't it? Oh, I've got a scanner in my hand. Let's just zap every badge within, a 3 meter radius of our stand, and it's not, I've said for a long time that, sheer quantity of scans on your badge scanning app or your device is not meaningful data by any stretch of the imagination. There could be 500 people walk past idly, and, if you've scanned those, that's not 500 genuine leads, is it?
No, definitely not. And that's why we come up with activations, or the way in which we designed the space to make sure that it's qualifying the people that approach ultimately. So is it someone that's just there to get, freebies or to get a free coffee? yes, they can do that, certainly, and the brand can still look after that sort of person. But really, we need to be creating the space to qualify them so that if they are having more of a serious conversation, there is a space to go for that, to have a demo or have a one-to-one conversation rather than being any old person that's approaching the booth.
If you are looking at things like dwell time as a more realistic sort of analytical data point, how are you actually analysing and monitoring dwell time in case to case?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. So we can use sensors. We have done on big, larger environments
Sure.
where you can actually track people through mobile phone signals and other tech, really. And we've done that to look at heat mapping and dwell time. We do that predominantly to make sure the flow is correct. So people around demos, etc., making sure that the way in which we're looking at the floor plan and space itself on a trade show or a consumer event, we really want to get that insight to understand the flow and how people are interacting with the space and learn from that. And ultimately, you get a metric off the back of that where you can give someone dwell time, and then ultimately that should link in with your next metric, which could be interactivity or a brand experience or a demo.
Are you able to model that in advance of events nowadays with the technology that's available? And it might seem like a bit of a left field question, but I asked it recently on the podcast, and that trade shows and brand activations, nobody debates the level of planning that goes into them, but in terms of actually getting anything from it and seeing people interact with it for the first time, often that is literally left to the moment when the doors open or the activation opens itself. I'm curious to know whether or not you're able to build in any sort of like testing and sort of modeling, utilizing tools that you've got available to you nowadays.
I mean, ultimately, that comes down to experience as well. So it's working with a team, and our team are really experienced with how people do interact with spaces. And I think that's something that's undervalued sometimes, is thinking about the multiple different touch points where sight lines and how different brand messaging and also the brand itself is being being presented, but also how people would interact with the space as they walk into it. I think it's definitely when you work or you execute and you're really thinking about that flow and the way in which humans interact ultimately with space, it's sometimes not thought about enough. And when you get a space that works very well, you can see it in action, and really it plays into making sure that the position of the brand's correct, as I said, and also the campaign or strap lines really front of mind for anyone approaching.
It's interesting that that point that you raised there ties into something that Mark was good enough to send me some sort of ideas and some notes prior to the podcast today, and there was a really sort of interesting sentence that jumped out at me, and it was right at the bottom of your notes that said, "The uncomfortable truth: a lot of engagement, quote unquote, is theatre, and clients are starting to notice." And my mind started racing. I thought, well, first of all, what do you mean by that? I started to interpret it in 2 or 3 different ways, actually, but I'd love you to expand on that if you could.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think it's ultimately when you see a brand that they're coming up with an activation or a statement and it feels gimmicky or unauthentic. I think that's the biggest thing. So what we look at is how is it being connected to the brand's identity and its personality? Is it reflecting what they stand for, who they are as a brand, and also is it going to connect with someone on a deeper level with how you want to? We're seeing a lot of brands sometimes come up with big statements that are amazing, huge amounts of money being spent with hanging screens or lighting rigs, etc., but are they ultimately supporting the brand and reflecting them as a brand itself? And I think sometimes it's really important to think about that and how the brand's transitioned into a physical space, and not just looking at spending the most amount of money on theatre, etc. It's got to feel authentic.
That's interesting. So B2B particularly is a competitive marketplace. If you're talking about events where you might have your competitor under the same roof at a trade show, for example, there has always been this thought that, well, we need to spend a lot of money. It needs to look great. It needs to feel great. It needs to be lit well. It needs to have the best audio. Everything needs to look cutting edge. sometimes depending on the brand and what message you're actually trying to send out, it sounds like you're saying actually it might not need those elements. It still needs to look good, it still needs to feel right, but it needs to feel right in the context of what the brand is about.
Yeah, definitely. And I think creativity and our ideas win ultimately. So if you've got an idea or creative that is more intelligent and more aligned with the brand and its messaging, that will win over someone spending lots of money on the biggest screen, for example. So if the campaign message or the space is designed really with that in mind from the very start, that's really reflected when you come across the space. And also competitor analysis is done. Often we look at other brands and how they're showing up to events, how they're positioning their campaign message, their demos, and then we ensure that the brand that we're working with, it has a competitive advantage by ultimately coming up with creative and more intelligent ideas and approaches.
Of the excuse me, the actual, so I suppose I'm going to call them data outcomes, but the actual sort of metrics and the data that's generated post event nowadays, have you as an agency been able to actually trace how budgets are changing, either increasing or decreasing indeed, based on tangible metrics and data that clients are able to see now from it? And actually coming back to you and saying, actually, we've been able to clearly see what we got from this, and actually we think if we invest a bit more with you, we can get this out of it.
Yeah, definitely we have seen that, and ultimately that's what we look for and get real satisfaction from, actually, is starting to work with a global brand who's just launching out. They're starting to, either they've got funding or they're trying to look at the key players within the industry and come up to their level. And that's where we really look for those sorts of clients to work with and align with, because it gives us great pleasure to see us creating that identity for them that competes at a very high global level. And also ultimately we support them with their growth. So they could, for example, do a 3-star sponsorship and then also have a medium-sized space at an event. We work with them by coming up with the activation. It could be the trade show booth, it could be experiential elements, and we really try and drive their growth. And then ultimately, when we see the results coming through, they start spending more money. They've seen the justification of the spend within their boardroom, so the CMO and CEO see that from the results, and they start actually taking out larger sponsors. So they cut sponsorships. They start becoming 5-star sponsors. They start spending more budget, etc. And that's because they've seen the growth off the back of it. And for us, we take great pleasure from that. And also we ultimately become a strategic creative partner for them. And we position ourselves as that, as an agency.
Where are you seeing it's okay, on the one hand, it's okay for a company and a brand and a client to come back to you and say, look, this is great, we want to go bigger and better, or we've got this new idea now for next year, so we want to do something different. But the S word will creep in at some point, sustainability. They'll look at it and they'll go, right, yes, we're getting good return on this and we're seeing that it's worth the economic output from the business because of the economic input that's coming in. But from a sustainability and a messaging point of view, where is that and how is that manifesting itself in this process?
Yeah, no, definitely. I think as an agency, we always look to embed sustainability into our process. So from the moment that we start working on something, we're thinking about how we can create assets or branded environments that can be reused. And that could be as a whole element that's the same size as what we're looking to create and build, or it could be in different smaller pieces as well. So we always promote reuse and also storage, and we can offer that at a global level as an agency. I think some of the clients, sustainability was really hot a couple of years ago. Now that budgets are getting tighter, we're not seeing it as much in briefs, to be honest. But I think as an agency, it doesn't have to cost money to be sustainable. It just needs the thought process and to really care about it. And that's where we're still promoting it, and we're still coming up with solutions that people can use and take forward into their global trade show or event campaigns.
How savvy have the clients become nowadays with all the tools that are at their disposal. We're exposed to so much more media and content nowadays that, in a short space of time, you can just pick up your phone. And if you're looking for a bit of inspiration or some ideas, and you've got a blank piece of paper in front of you, pretty quickly you can start getting a bit of inspiration from any number of sources. Are your clients coming to you now with much clearer, initial briefs and an idea in their head about what they would like and how they see things manifesting themselves? And how has that sort of changed the creative process between you and the client?
Yeah, no, definitely. I think it's a great question. We're seeing it at different levels, to be honest. When you're dealing with one brand, it could be their marketing director, CMO, or event manager. I think it's always led by the top. So that could be C-level or CMO, and you're seeing the way in which they want the brand to approach things. Ultimately, they set that out at the beginning of the year and their metrics and how they would like to be tracking return on investment itself. So I think what we're seeing is, sorry about that. What we're seeing is
you and me both today. I'm full of
it. Yeah. What we're seeing is that different brands do come up with different metrics as they're approaching the agency, but ultimately they always have an element of return on investment, and they're asking us to come up with how they can track that itself. Yeah. But sorry, I'm just going to have to cough again.
No, far away. I've been terrible for it. I've been carrying it since I flew back. I was abroad last week. So, sorry to digress, podcast listeners, but I was abroad last week and picked up the typical sort of flight home sniffle, and sort of 2 days later, I've been terrible today, dry throat. So I feel your pain, Mark. I was gonna that client kind of led briefing approach can be a good and a bad thing. I've often thought, in terms of, it's great when a client comes to you with a great idea and a clear vision of what they want to achieve. That can make your process so much better. But the flip side to that coin is they might come with an idea that they think is absolutely brilliant that you then maybe got to just pick apart a little bit and go back to what you were saying earlier on in today's conversation about what are your actual objectives from this, what you're looking to achieve, reverse engineering the process a little bit. Do you find yourself in situations like that where the ideas come in a very enthusiastic level, but maybe just have to be tweaked to actually let the client realize that it might not meet the objectives and the outcomes that they want?
Yeah, definitely. I think what we're seeing is, if you see something that is in a brief or discussed and it's come out of left field, or you're thinking, well, why is that included? I think it's, as an agency, how you create value in that process is pushing back and questioning the brief. So it's working through it with them and understanding where that has come from. And then ultimately, sometimes we've done that with some clients, and it's reshaped the approach and the brief itself. Sure. And that, from us, from our perspective, that's where we create real value as an agency.
No, absolutely. And I suppose one thing that we haven't asked yet is are you able to sort of, tell us about some of the clients that you work with, exciting things that are on the horizon this year? I often assume that when we talk to agencies on the podcast that they're all going to be under NDAs and you can't actually mention any names. But, I always think it's fair to ask you, and they give a shout out. Who have you worked with?
No, definitely. I think some of our projects we are under NDAs and we don't share as much as we possibly would like to or could. But I mean, some of our global clients, we're one of the global agencies for Pokémon. So they're obviously a well-known brand. We deal with a lot of their events from B2B to B2C. And that's...
I mean, I don't know whether or not it's just me imagining, but I'm seeing sort of a big surge again in Pokémon. For some reason, I keep seeing it, and the cards are back in fashion again with young people. It seems to have kind of had a bit of a resurgence, if I'm right in saying so.
No, definitely. I mean, since we started working with Pokémon, I think it was 5 years ago, I think their revenue was 2.5 billion, and now it's up to 5. So that tells you the growth that the brand's seen. And COVID really accelerated that for the brand because, as you say, people are collecting. The biggest take home that we've seen from the audience and the target audience for Pokemon B2B and B2C is that really it's not children buying their products, it's actually people with money now. So it's people that collected when they were younger. They've now obviously got older, and they have jobs now, and they can afford to pay for lots of these collectibles.
Yeah. What an amazing sort of. I mean, that's a whole other subject there, isn't it? But brands taking advantage of historical, I suppose, legacy of legacy customers who may have spent money or been interacting with them, 10, 15, 20 years ago, and now those people are in a position to actually spend that bit more money. You see it in the music industry all the time. Legacy bands touring, kids who loved them when they were younger, but maybe couldn't afford a ticket, and now they can. Now they can go and see them. That's why some of these sort of legacy bands from the 80s and 90s are still out there doing it, because the people that grew up with them have now got the money to go and spend and have a great weekend away at a festival or something like that.
Yeah, and I think it's really special to see that when anyone's really passionate about a brand or a band. I think it's really special to see that, and we love working with that particular brand because we get to see the fans and how they're so passionate about them. But as I say, we work with them across B2C, so that is fans and retail, but also across B2B. So we are dealing with their brand licensing team, and that is in a B2B setting where they're having one-to-one meetings and they're looking at brand licensing that they could have with retailers.
Fabulous! It's been great to sort of get you on it, and it's flown past today. I always say it's a great podcast when it absolutely sort of goes past in the blink of an eye. And excuse me, I've looked at the clock, and we're 26, 27 minutes into it, and it feels like we've been talking for a couple of minutes. Before we wrap up today, Mark, it's really important, as always, that we let our podcast followers and listeners know how to track down a guest if they need to, get hold of them, if they've got a question they want to ask you directly. Where's the best place to find you, and where's the best place to find Inception?
No, definitely. We're at inceptionww.com. Our office is in Waterloo, so we're in central London. And we go to a lot of the global events, a lot of the trade shows itself, and I'm on LinkedIn as well. So Mark Hutchinson at Inception.
Fantastic. No, it's been great to talk to you. And I referenced at the start there's a bit of a time difference today. So Mark, God bless him, has had to get up very early this morning and fill himself with coffee in order to have a bit of a chat today. But we do appreciate Mark, and it's been great to have you on the podcast for the first time. Let's hope to see you again on another episode further down the line.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks, James.
And before we wrap up, just a couple of very, very quick mentions for event industry news. As always, if you've started your journey today by listening to today's podcast on your podcast platform, thanks very much for listening to us. Make sure that you like and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts from so that you get all the new episodes when they drop. Please also make sure that you head over to eventindustrynews.com where you can watch video versions of all of our podcasts. And whilst you are there, you can also check out the latest news, features and special supplements that are available on the website, as well, of course, as the supplier directory. If you work in the events industry and you're looking for a product, service, a supplier, a tech platform, anything like that, chances are you will find it within the supplier directory on eventindustrynews.com. You may, of course, have started your journey there today by watching today's podcast. If you have, thank you very much for doing so. Please do make sure that you go in the opposite direction and search for the Event Industry News podcast wherever you get your podcasts from, and make sure that you're subscribed to the audio versions of those. Thanks again to my guest today, Mark Hutchinson, the Managing Director of Inception, for joining me, and we'll see you all on the next edition of the podcast. Thanks, everybody.